Shocking UFC facts even fighters don't know. Okay, let's be real for a second. If you're a UFC fan or even just a casual observer, you probably think you know everything about the sport. Its legends, fights, and behind-the-scenes drama. But hold on, there are some mind-blowing facts about the UFC that will make even the most hardcore fans and fighters pause for a second. Ready for some surprising truths? Let's dive into a few jaw-dropping facts that will leave you shaking your head in disbelief. 1. The UFC almost got bought by Disney. Yes, you read that right. In the early 2000s, the UFC was struggling financially. They were seriously on the brink of being bought out, and guess who almost swooped in? Disney. But it wasn't just Disney. Other major entertainment companies were considering buying the UFC as well, but Dana White stepped in and turned the ship around. The UFC we know today was saved from an unknown fate by some serious business moves, and thank goodness for that. Imagine the UFC under Disney's control. Could you see Mickey Mouse entering the octagon? 2. The UFC once had a champion who never won a fight. Here's a wild one. Did you know that the UFC once had a fighter who technically held a championship belt without winning a single fight? Sounds like a mistake, right? Well, not exactly. In 1993, Kevin Randleman earned a title shot for the heavyweight belt despite losing his previous fight. The match was so insane, Randleman eventually became the champ after his opponent, Maurice Smith, was forced to retire. It was a total freak scenario, but Randleman is officially considered one of the most controversial champs in UFC history.
Hammer 3.
Dana White is a massive boxing fan. You probably know Dana White as the face of the UFC. He's been the president for years and often takes the heat for decisions and drama. But did you know that Dana White is a huge boxing fan? Yep, before making the UFC his empire, he was obsessed with boxing, especially the fights of Muhammad Ali and Mike Tyson. Dana has often said that the sport of boxing played a huge role in his approach to the UFC, from promoting the events to understanding the business side of things. Without boxing's influence, who knows if the UFC would have reached the level it's at today? 4. The UFC once hosted a fight between a pro boxer and a UFC fighter. Speaking of boxing, in one of the most shocking crossover events, the UFC once hosted a match where a pro boxer took on a UFC fighter. The fight took place in 1998 when James Toney, a professional boxer, challenged Randy Couture to a bout in the octagon. Spoiler alert, Toney got absolutely demolished. It wasn't even close. Couture, being a decorated wrestler, took him down immediately and ended the fight in the first round with a submission. But this event was so monumental because it was one of the first times the UFC had mixed combat sports to this level. The UFC doesn't pay fighters as much as you think. One of the most shocking facts about the UFC is how much fighters actually make compared to what most people assume. While it's true some top fighters like Conor McGregor and Khabib Nurmagomedov rake in millions, the average UFC fighter doesn't make nearly as much as you might think. In fact, the base salary for many fighters is pretty low, and only those who rise to the top or get endorsements see the big paydays. Even more shocking, many fighters often rely on sponsorship deals for the bulk of their income, especially before they're in the limelight. I know. You're probably surprised by some of these facts, right? It's crazy to think that even fighters don't know the entire history behind the UFC. That's what makes this sport so fascinating. It's constantly evolving, filled with hidden surprises, and always pushing the boundaries of what we know about it. Number 6, the UFC has the longest pay-per-view record in sports. Think the UFC is just a fighting league? Think again. The UFC actually holds the longest-running pay-per-view record in sports. The first ever UFC pay-per-view was in 1993, and since then the UFC has grown massively, constantly breaking records for PPV sales. But one of the most surprising things? The UFC's PPV events often outshine even major sports like boxing and wrestling, drawing massive attention and viewership worldwide. It's crazy to think that the UFC, a sport that started in a tiny arena, now pulls in millions of viewers per event. 7. Fighters can be cut for not showing up for weigh-ins. Okay, here's something you might not know. UFC fighters have to go through an incredibly strict process to be part of the roster, and one of the easiest ways to get cut is to miss a weigh-in. If a fighter fails to show up on time or doesn't meet weight requirements, they could be dropped from the organization. No warning, no second chances, just gone. It's tough, but the UFC takes discipline and commitment very seriously. It's all part of what makes the sport so intense. I want to thank you for sticking around for these shocking UFC facts. Hope you've learned a thing or two. The UFC is so much more than just a collection of fights and fighters. It's a complex world full of fascinating history, incredible athletes, and unbelievable stories that most people will never know. The next time you watch a fight, you'll have a whole new level of respect for the sport and the people behind it. Keep your mind open, because with the UFC, you never know what's coming next.